The Dawn raids were a crackdown in New Zealand from the mid-1970s to the early 1980s on illegal overstayers from the Pacific Islands. The raids were first introduced in 1973 by Norman Kirk's Labour government and were continued by Rob Muldoon's national government. These operations involved special police squads conducting raids on the homes and workplaces of overstayers throughout New Zealand, usually at dawn. Overstayers and their families were often prosecuted and then deported back to their countries. Dawn raids were particularly controversial as despite Pacific Islanders only making up one-third of overstayers, they accounted for 86% of those arrested and prosecuted. The majority of overstayers were from Great Britain, South Africa and the United States. The Dawn raids were a product of the New Zealand government's immigration policies to attract more Pacific Islanders. Since the 1950s, the New Zealand government had encouraged substantial emigration from several Pacific countries, including Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji to fill a labour shortage caused by the post-war economic boom. Consequently, the Pacific Islander population in New Zealand had grown to 45,000 by 1971, with a substantial number overstaying their visas. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, New Zealand's economy had declined due to several international developments. A decline in international wool prices in 1966, Britain joining the European Economic Community in 1973, which deprived New Zealand of a major market for dairy products, and the 1973 oil crisis. This economic downturn led to increased crime, unemployment and other social ailments, which disproportionately affected the Pacific Islander community. In response to these social problems, Prime Minister Kirk created a special police task force in Auckland in 1973 which was tasked with dealing with overstayers. Its powers also included the power to conduct random checks on suspected overstayers. Throughout 1974, the New Zealand police conducted dawn raids against overstayers which sparked criticism from human rights groups and sections of the press. In response to public criticism, the Labour Immigration Minister Fraser Coleman suspended the dawn raids until the government developed a concerted plan. In April 1974, Kirk also introduced a 2-month amnesty period for overstayers to register themselves with the authorities and be granted a 2-month visa extension. Kirk's changes in policies were criticized by the mainstream press, which highlighted crimes and violence perpetrated by Maori and Pacific Islanders. In July 1974, the opposition National Party leader Muldoon promised to reduce immigration and to get tough on law and order issues if his party was elected as government. He criticized the Labour government's immigration policies for contributing to the economic recession and a housing shortage. During the 1975 general elections, the National Party also played a controversial electoral advertisement that was later criticized for stoking negative racial sentiments about Polynesian migrants. Once in power, Muldoon's government accelerated the Kirk government's police raids against Pacific overstayers. The dawn raids were condemned by different sections of New Zealand society including the Pacific Islander and Maori communities, church groups, employers and workers' unions, anti-racist groups, and the opposition Labour Party. One Pacific group known as the Polynesian Panthers combated the dawn raids by providing legal aid to detainees and staging retaliatory dawn raids on several national cabinet ministers including Bill Birch and Frank Gill, the Minister of Immigration. The raids were also criticized by elements of the police and the ruling National Party for damaging race relations with the Pacific Island community. Kim Workman, who was a senior sergeant in Lower Hutt at the time, left the police force over his opposition to the racism displayed in the police response. Critics also alleged that the dawn raids unfairly targeted Pacific Islanders since Pacific Islanders only comprised one-third of the overstayers but made up 86% of those arrested and prosecuted for overstaying. The majority of overstayers were from Great Britain, South Africa and the United States. The Muldoon government's treatment of overstayers also damaged relations with Pacific countries like Samoa and Tonga, and generated criticism from the South Pacific Forum. By 1979, the Muldoon government terminated the Dawn raids since the deportation of illegal Pacific overstayers had failed to alleviate the ailing New Zealand economy. During the late 1970s and 1980s, Pacific migrants continued to enter and settle in New Zealand through both legal and illegal means. In 2002, the New Zealand government introduced a Samoan immigration quota that allowed 1,100 Samoan citizens each year to receive New Zealand residency provided they had a job offer and met other immigration requirements. In addition, the government